Happy Monday! How is everyone doing? I'm Charlotte, and this is Quarantine Story Time, where we are using the shelter in place from COVID-19 to dig into some classic literature, notably one of the longest books in Western literature, War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Boom. So we've been doing this for a little bit now, and we are almost halfway through. We'll finish it before the end of the year. We'll be done with it before we're done with COVID-19. Any of these other positive thoughts. But yes, welcome back. We are in volume 2, part 5 now, and we are going to start in section 3 and read through section 8. And as I promised, because the end of last week, the readings were really short, I am going to do a longer reading today, hopefully to kind of get us back some more steam. Thanks for everyone who's been subscribing and watching. It's always encouraging to see people online watching with me live, because I'm reading this for the first time when I read it with you. And so I just think that's kind of a really fun thing that we can do together, even if we're apart. I do have the live chat up today, so feel free to drop a line and say hi. That's always nice. And always check out the links and resources in the description for the video after they're posted, after being live, because I've put a bunch of different resources up for ways to help fight for racial equality in America, because that's as big as a endemic problem as COVID-19. So trying to stop the spread of COVID-19, and hopefully we can also address racism. Not to sound flippant, but it is something that does need to be addressed. So we can all do if we all do a little bit, it'll add up to a lot for all things. So I believe that. I know my mom sent me something. I'll put that up. It was and if anyone else has any other really great links or things they've been doing or watching or reading, feel free to drop a comment after or in the live chat, and so we can mention it or add it to my list. It's always great to see what other people are doing and how they're using their time positively, because it can really kind of wear us down, everything that's going on. So I hope everyone is I don't want to say staying positive, because that always feels superficial, but staying at peace and focused on sort of goodness and truth and grace, hopefully, those sort of things. So anyways, that's my little pep talk for Monday morning. You got this, and I've got this. So what do we have? We are back we were focusing on the Rostovs, remember? And Natasha is supposed to marry Andrei Bolkonsky, but their secret engagement is drawing out, and she's just getting more and more discouraged about, this time that she's wasting, and wondering if he's well, and feeling like her life is slowly draining away from her, that sort of thing. Meanwhile, his father's mental health is getting worse, Andrei Bolkonsky, and he's becoming more and more unreasonable. He's in Moscow with his daughter and his niece and Mademoiselle Bourrienne. Mademoiselle Bourrienne is receiving his new affection for her, which he started just to spite his kids, and now kind of seems like a strange new thing. Hey, good to see you. Welcome. He's tormenting his daughter. His daughter is also trying to teach her nephew, Andrei Bolkonsky's son, and he's a little boy, and as little boys do, he's not they're having trouble with the teacher and student relationship there. The Rostovs are a family, their finances are in horrible trouble. And rather than marry someone wealthy, Nikolai Rostov has decided to marry Sonia and has proposed to her, which caused an upset in the family, but they're kind of dealing with it. And Julie Kerrigan, who they wanted Nikolai to marry and who was used to be very good friends with Prince Andrei's sister, Princess Maria, she is now quite wealthy because unfortunately her brothers have passed away due to the war, and so she is inheriting the whole family fortune. So she is quite the most eligible heiress. And rather than find comfort in her friend during these difficult times, Princess Maria being so close to her and her friend being in this new sphere of influence, she's found her not to be quite as the person she enjoyed being around as much or enjoyed writing to. So everyone's feeling a bit of upheaval. And it seems everyone's gone to Moscow. The Rostovs were going to go to Moscow to sell a family estate. And that's where the Bolkonskys are. And I think that's where Prince Andrei is going to head as soon as he returns back from his trip to Europe. So that's where we are, more or less. Let's jump back in volume 2, part 5, section 3. In 1811, there was living in Moscow a French doctor who quickly became the fashion, a man of immense height, handsome, amiable as Frenchmen are, and, as all Moscow said, extraordinarily skillful in his profession, métivier. He was received in the houses of high society not as a doctor, but as an equal. Prince Nikolai Andreevich, who had always laughed at medical science, had recently, at the advice of Mademoiselle Bourrienne, admitted this doctor to his presence and grown used to him. Métivier called on the prince twice a week. On St. Nicholas's Day, the prince's name day, all Moscow came to his door, but he gave orders to receive no one and to invite only a few to dinner, the list of whom he gave to Princess Maria. Métivier, arriving on the morning with his felicitations, found it appropriate in his quality as a doctor de forcer la consigne disobey orders, as he said to Princess Maria, and went to see the prince. It so happened that on the morning of his name day, the old prince was in one of his worst moods. He had been going wearily about the house all morning, picking on everyone and pretending that he did not understand what was said to him and that he himself was not understood. Princess Maria knew only too well this mood of quiet and preoccupied grumbling, which usually resolved itself into an outburst of rage, and she went about all morning as if under a loaded and cocked gun, awaiting the inevitable shot. Upon the doctor's arrival, the morning had gone fairly well. Until the doctor's arrival, the morning had gone fairly well. Having let the doctor in, Princess Maria sat down with a book in the drawing room, from where she could hear everything that was happening in the study. First she heard only Métivier's voice, then her father's voice, then both voices began to speak at once. The door was thrown open, and on the threshold appeared the frightened, handsome figure of Métivier, with his black forelock, and the figure of the prince in his nightcap and robe, his face distorted by rage, and the pupils of his eyes rolled downwards. "You don't understand," the prince was shouting, "but I do. French spy, Bonaparte's slave and spy, out of my house. Out, I say," and he slammed the door. Métivier, shrugging his shoulders, went over to Mademoiselle Bourrienne, who was hearing the shouting, had come running from the neighboring room. "The prince is not entirely well. La balle le transporte à Seville. Tranquillez-vous, je reparaîtrai demain." "Bile and a seizure of the brain. Calm yourself. I'll come back tomorrow," said Métivier. Putting his finger to his lips, he hurriedly left. Behind the door, slippered footsteps were heard and shouts. "Spies! Traitors! Traitors everywhere! Not a moment's peace in my own house!" After Métivier's departure, the old prince called his daughter to him, and the force of his wrath fell upon her. It was her fault that a spy had been let into his rooms. Yet he had told her, had he told her to make a list and not let anyone in? Not on the list? Why had this scoundrel been let in? She was the cause of it all. With her he could not have a moment's peace. He could not die in peace, he said. No, my dear, we must part, we must part. Let it be known to you. No, my dear, we must part. We must part. Let it be known to you. I cannot have it any more, he said, and left the room. And, as if fearing she might somehow comfort herself, he came back and, trying to assume a calm look, added, Don't think I said it to you in a moment of anger. I am calm, and have thought it all over. It will be. We must part. Find yourself a place. But he could not control himself, and with that spitefulness which belongs only to someone who loves, he shook his fists at her, obviously suffering, and screamed, If only some fool would marry her! He slammed the door, summoned Mademoiselle Bourrienne, and quieted down in his study. At 2 o'clock, the 6 chosen persons gathered for dinner. The guests, the well-known Count Rostopchin, Prince Lapukin with his nephew, General Chatrov, the prince's old wartime friend, and of the young men, Pierre and Boris Dubretskoy awaited him in the drawing room. Having come to Moscow on leave a few days earlier, Boris had wished to be introduced to Prince Nikolai Andreevich, and had managed to win his favor to such a degree that the prince had made him an exception among all the young bachelors whom he did not receive. The prince's house was not what was known as society, but it was a small circle which, though not much talked about in town, was very flattering to be received in. Boris had understood that a week ago when, in his presence, Rostopchin had said to the commander-in-chief, in response to his invitation to dinner on St. Nicholas's Day, that he could not come. On that day I always go to venerate the relics of Prince Nikolai Andreevich. Ah, yes, the commander-in-chief had said. How is he? The small company that gathered before the dinner in the old-fashioned drawing-room, with its high ceilings and old furniture, resembled a solemn court in session. Everyone was silent, and if they spoke softly. Prince Nikolai Andreevich came out, serious and silent. Princess Maria seemed still more quiet and timid than usual. The guests were reluctant to address her because they saw that she was not following their conversation. Count Rostopchin alone maintained the thread of conversation, telling about the latest town or political news. Lapukin and the old general took little part in the conversation. Prince Nikolai Andreevich listened as a Supreme Court justice listens to a report being made to him, only occasionally indicating by a grunt or a brief pause that he had taken into consideration what was being reported to him. The tone of the conversation made it clear that no one approved of what was happening in the political world. Events were recounted which obviously confirmed that everything was getting worse and worse, but it was striking that in each account and opinion, the narrator stopped or was stopped each time at that limit where disapproval might refer to the person of the sovereign emperor. Over dinner, the conversation turned to the latest political news about Napoleon's seizure of the lands of the Duke of Oldenburg and about a Russian note denouncing Bonaparte which had been sent to all the European courts. Bonaparte behaves with Europe like a pirate on a captured ship, said Count Rostopchin, repeating a phrase he had already uttered several times. One is only astonished at the patience or blindness of the sovereigns. It has now gone on as far as the Pope, and Bonaparte, feeling no scruples, wants to overthrow the head of the Catholic religion. And everyone is silent. Only our sovereign protested against the seizure of the Duke of Oldenburg's lands. And even then, Count Rostopchin fell silent, sensing that he was standing at the limit where it was no longer possible to disapprove. Though I offered him other lands in place of the Dukedom of Oldenburg, said Prince Nikolai Andreevich. He moves the dukes around the way I move peasants from Bald Hills to Bogucharovo and my Ryazan estates. Le Duc de Oldenburg se porte son malheur avec une force de caractère et une résignation admirables. The Duke of Oldenburg bears his misfortune with admirable strength of character and resignation, said Boris, respectfully entering into the conversation. He said it because, on his way from Petersburg, he had had the honor of being introduced to the Duke. Prince Nikolai Andreevich looked at the young man as if he wanted to tell him something about that, but changed his mind, considering him too young for it. I read our protest about the Oldenburg affair and was astonished at the poor wording of this note, Count Rostopchin said in a careless tone of a man judging a matter that was very familiar to him. Pierre looked at Rostopchin with naive astonishment, not understanding why he was disturbed by the poor wording of the note. Does it make any difference how the note is worded, Count, he said, if the content is strong? Mon cher, avec nos 500,000 hommes de troupes "Il serait facile d'avoir un beau style." "My dear, with our 500,000 troops, it would easily to have a good style," said Count Rostopchin. Pierre understood why Count Rostopchin was disturbed by the wording of the note. "It seems there are a lot of scribblers around," said the old prince. "They're in Petersburg. They're writing all the time, not only notes, but new laws. My Andrusha wrote a whole volume of laws for Russia there. Nowadays, everybody writes," and he laughed unnaturally. The conversation ceased for a moment, and the old general cleared his throat to draw attention to himself. "Did you hear about the latest event at the review in Petersburg? What a show the new French ambassador made of himself." "What's that? Yes, I heard something. He said something awkward in His Majesty's presence." His Majesty drew his attention to the Grenadier Division and the ceremonial march past, the general went on, and the ambassador supposedly paid no attention to it and supposedly allowed himself to say that we in France pay no attention to such trifles. The sovereign did not deign to reply. At the next review, they say the sovereign did not deign to address him even once. Everyone fell silent. About this fact, which referred personally to the sovereign, it was impossible to express any opinion. "Insolent fellows," said the prince. "Do you know Metivier? I threw him out today. He was here. He was let in to see me, though I have asked them not to let anyone in," said the prince, looking angrily at his daughter. And he recounted the whole conversation with the French doctor and the reason why he had become convinced that Metivier was a spy. Though those reasons were quite insufficient and unclear, no one objected. After the roast, champagne was served. The guests got up from their places to congratulate the old prince. Princess Maria also went up to him. He gave her a cold, angry look and offered her his wrinkled, clean-shaven cheek. The whole expression of his face told her that he had not forgotten their morning conversation, that his decision remained in force, and that it was only owing to the presence of the guests that he did not tell her so now. When they went out to the drawing-room for coffee, the old men sat together. Prince Nikolai Andreevich became more animated and voiced his way of thinking about the impending war. He said that our wars with Bonaparte would be unsuccessful so long as we sought alliances with the Germans and meddled in the affairs of Europe, which we had been drawn into by the Peace of Tilsit. We had no need to fight either for or against Austria. Our politics all lie in the East. In relation to Bonaparte, there is one thing: armed borders and foreign politics. He will never dare cross Russian borders as in the year 7. "And far be it for us to fight the French, Prince," said Count Rostopchin. "How can we oppose our teachers and gods? Look at our youth. Look at our ladies. The French are our gods, and our kingdom of heaven is Paris." He began to speak more loudly, obviously so that everyone could hear him. "French clothes, French thoughts, French feelings. And here you threw Metivier out because he's French and a scoundrel, but our ladies go crawling after him. Yesterday I was at Soiree, and out of 5 ladies there, 3 were Catholic, and with the Pope's permission were doing embroidery on Sunday. And they said there all but and they sat there all but naked like a signboard for a public bathhouse, if I may say so. Prince, when you look at our young people, you want to take Peter the Great's old cudgel from Kutzkamera and give them a good drubbing to beat all the foolishness out of them." They all fell silent. The old prince looked at Rostopchin with a smile on his face, shaking his head approvingly. "Well, goodbye, Your Excellency. Be well," said Rostopchin, getting up with his peculiarly quick movements and holding out his hand to the prince. "Goodbye, dear heart. It's always like a harp listening to him," said the old prince, holding him by the hand and offering him his cheek for a kiss. The others got up along with Rostopchin. Section 4. Sitting in the drawing-room and listening to this talk and gossip among the old men, Princess Maria understood nothing of what she heard. She was thinking only of whether the guests had noticed her father's hostile attitude towards her. She did not even notice the special attention and courtesy shown her during the dinner by Drubetskoy, who was already visiting their house for the 3rd time. Princess Maria turned, with an absent-minded, questioning look, to Pierre, who, the last of the guests, hat in hand and a smile on his face, went up to her after the prince had gone and said they were left alone in the drawing-room. "May I sit a while longer?" he asked, letting his fat body sink into an armchair beside Princess Maria. "Oh, yes," she said, and her glance added, "Did you notice anything?" Pierre was in a quiet after-dinner mood. He looked straight ahead and smiled quietly. "Have you known that young man for a long time, Princess?" he asked. "Which one?" Dubretskoy. No, not long. And do you like him? Yes, he's a pleasant young man. Why do you ask me that? Said Princess Marya, still thinking about her morning conversation with her father. Because I've made an observation. A young man usually comes to Moscow from Petersburg only with the aim of marrying a rich bride. You have made that observation? Asked Princess Marya. Yes, Pierre went on with a smile, and this young man now behaves himself in such a way, wherever there's a rich bride, he's there too. I can read him like a book. He's undecided now whom to attack, you or Mademoiselle Julie Kerrigan. Il est très assidu après d'elle. He's very attentive to her. Does he visit, then? Yes, very often. And do you know the new way of courting? Pierre said with a merry smile, clearly being in the merry mood of good-natured mockery for which he reproached himself so often in his diary. No, said Princess Marya. Nowadays, in order to please Moscow girls, il fait être mélancolique. Et il est très mélancolique après de Mademoiselle Kerrigan, said Pierre. One must be melancholy. He is very melancholy with Mademoiselle Kerrigan. Vraiment? Really? Said Princess Marya, looking into Pierre's kind face and never ceasing to think about her grief. It would be easier for me, she thought, if I had decided to confide everything I feel to someone, and I'd like to tell it all precisely to Pierre. He's so kind and noble, it would make it easier for me. He could give me advice. Would you consider marrying him? Asked Pierre. Ah, my God, Count, there are moments when I'd marry anybody, Princess Marya said suddenly, to her own surprise, with tears in her voice. Ah, how painful it is to love a person who is so close to you and feel that you can do nothing for him, she went on in a trembling voice, except grieve him. And when you know that you cannot change that, there's only one thing left, to go away. But where will I go? What is it? What's wrong, Princess? But the princess, without finishing, began to cry. I don't know what's the matter with me. Don't listen to me. Forget what I've told you. All of Pierre's cheerfulness vanished. Yes, the princess worried questions, begged her to tell him everything, to confide her grief to him. But she only repeated that she begged him to forget what she had said, that she did not remember what she had said, that she had no grief except that one he knew, that Prince Andrei's marriage threatened to make father and son quarrel. Have you heard anything about the Rostovs? She asked in order to change the subject. I was told they would be here soon. I also expect Andrei any day. I wish they could see each other here. And how does he look at that matter now? Asked Pierre, meaning the old prince. Princess Marya shook her head. But what's to be done? There's only a few months before the year is out. And it's bound to happen. I only wish I could spare my brother the first moments. I wish they'd come soon. I hope to become close to her. You've known them a long time, said Princess Marya. Tell me, hand on heart, the whole real truth. What kind of a girl is she, and how do you find her? But the whole truth, because you understand Andrei is risking so much in doing this against his father's will that I'd like to know. A vague instinct told Pierre that all these reservations and repeated requests to tell the whole truth expressed Princess Marya's ill will toward her future sister-in-law, that she wished Pierre to disapprove of Prince Andrei's choice. But Pierre said that said what he felt rather than what he thought. I don't know how to answer your question, he said, blushing without knowing why himself. I decidedly don't know what kind of girl she is. I simply cannot analyze her. She's enchanting. But why, I don't know. That's all one can say about her. Princess Marya sighed, and the expression of her face said, Yes, that's what I expected and was afraid of. Is she intelligent? Asked Princess Marya. Pierre pondered. I don't think so, he said. Although, yes, she doesn't deign to be intelligent, and no, she's enchanting, that's all. Princess Marya again shook her head disapprovingly. I wish so much to love her. Tell her that if you see her before I do. I've heard they'll be here one of these days, said Pierre. Princess Marya told Pierre that she planned, as soon as the Rostovs arrived, to become close with her future sister-in-law and to try to get the old prince used to her. Section 5. Boris had failed to marry a rich bride in Petersburg and had come with the same purpose to Moscow. In Moscow, Boris hesitated between the two richest brides, Julie and Princess Marya. Though Princess Marya, despite her plainness, seemed more attractive to him than Julie, he found it awkward, for some reason, to court Princess Bolkonsky. Just during his last meeting with her, on the old prince's name day, to all his attempts to talk about feelings with her, She had responded beside the point and had obviously not been listening to him. Julie, on the contrary, though in her own peculiar way, willingly accepted his courtship. Julie was 27 years old. After the death of her brothers, she had become very rich. She was by now utterly plain, but she thought that she was not only as good-looking, but was even far more attractive now than she had been before. She was maintained in that delusion by the fact that, first of all, she had become a very rich bride, and second, that the older she became, the less dangerous she was for men. The more freely men treated her, and without taking any obligations upon themselves, profited from her suppers, soirees, and the lively company that gathered in her house. A man who, 10 years before, would have been afraid of going every day to a house where there was a 17-year-old girl, so as not to compromise her and bind himself, now boldly came to her every day and treated her not as a prospective bride, but as an acquaintance who had no sex. That winter, the Kerrigan's house was the most agreeable and hospitable house in Moscow. Besides formal soirees and dinners, each day at the Kerrigans a large company gathered, especially of men, who had supper around midnight and stayed till 3 in the morning. There was no ball, theatrical, or promenade that Julie missed. Her dresses were always the most fashionable, but in spite of that, Julie seemed disappointed in everything. Said to everyone that she believed neither in friendship nor in love, nor in any of the joys of life, expected peace only there. She had adopted the tone of a girl who had lived through a great disappointment, a girl who, as it were, had lost a beloved man or been cruelly deceived by him. Though none of it had happened to her, people looked at her as if it had, and she herself only believed that she had suffered much in her life. This melancholy, which did not keep her from making merry, also did not keep the young people who visited her from passing the time pleasantly. Each guest who came to them gave its due to the hostess' melancholy mood, and then occupied himself with society talk and dancing and parlor games and tournaments of bouts which were fashionable at the Kerrigans. Only some of the young men, Boris among them, entered more deeply into Julie's melancholy mood, and with these young men she had become more prolonged than solitary conversations on the vanity of worldly things, and opened for them her albums filled with sad images, sayings, and verses. Julie was especially affectionate with Boris. She was sorry for his early disappointment in life, offering him what consolations of friendship she could offer, having suffered so much in life herself, and she opened her album for him. Boris drew 2 trees in her album and wrote, Arbres rustiques, vos sombres ramures sécontes, sur moi le ténébreux et le mélancolie. Rustic trees, your gloomy branches shake darkness and melancholy down on me. In another place he drew a tomb and wrote, La mort est secourable et la mort est tranquille. Ah, contre les douleurs, il n'y a pas d'autre asile. Death is helpful and death is peaceful. Ah, against sorrows there is no other refuge. Julie said that this was charming. Il est quelque chose de ravissant dans les oreilles de la mélancolie. She recited to Boris, word for word, a phrase she had copied from a book. C'est son royaume de lumière dans l'ombre, une nuance entre le douleur et le désespoir que montre la consolation possible. There is something so enchanting in the smile of melancholy. It is a ray of light in the darkness, a nuance between sorrow and despair, which shows consolation possible. To this, Boris wrote down verses for her. Aliments des poissons d'une âme trop sensible, tu sens que le bonheur me serait impossible. Tendre mélancolie, ah, viens me consoler, viens calmer les tourments de la sombre prêtrée, et mêlons de cieux secrets, assez plus que je sens colère. Poisonous foods for too sensitive a soul, thou without whom happiness would be impossible for me. Tender melancholy, ah, come to console me, come to calm the torments of my gloomy retreat, and mingle a secret sweetness with these tears which I feel flowing. Julie played the most mournful nocturnes on the harp for Boris. Boris reading Poor Liza aloud to her and interrupted his reading more than once from emotions that robbed him of breath. Meeting at a large gathering, Julie and Boris looked at each other as the only people in a sea of the indifferent who understood each other. Anna Mikhailovna, who often visited the Karagins and played cards with the mother, meanwhile obtained trustworthy information about what would come with Julie. What would come were the 2 Penza estates and the woodlands in Nizhny Novgorod province. Anna Mikhailovna, given over to the will of Providence, looked with tenderness upon the refined sorrow that bound her son to the rich Julie. Toujours charmant et mélancolique, cette chère Julie. Ever charming and melancholy, this sweet Julie, she said to the daughter. Boris says his soul is eased in your house. He has suffered so many disappointments, and he is so sensitive, she said to the mother. Ah, my friend, how attached I've become to Julie lately, she said to her son. I can't describe it to you, and who could possibly not love her? She's such an unearthly being. Ah, Boris, Boris. She would fall silent for a moment. And how sorry I am for her maman, she would go on. Today she showed me reports and letters from Penza. They have an enormous estate, and she does everything alone, poor thing. They deceive her so much. Boris smiled almost imperceptibly, listening to his mother. He laughed meekly at her simple-hearted slyness, but he listened to her and occasionally questioned her attentively about the Penza and Nizhny Novgorod estates. Julie had long been expecting a proposal from her melancholy admirer and was prepared to accept it, but some secret feeling of aversion for her passionate desire to get married, and for her unnaturalness and a feeling of horror at renouncing the possibility of true love, still stopped Boris. The time of his leave was coming to an end. All day and every blessed day he spent at the Karagins, and every day reasoning with himself, Boris said to himself that he would propose the next day. But in Julie's presence, looking at her red face and chin, almost always daubed with powder, at her moist eyes and the expression on her face which showed a permanent readiness to change at once from melancholy to the unnatural rapture of marital happiness, Boris was unable to utter the decisive words. Despite the fact that, in his imagination, he had long considered himself the owner of the Penza and Nizhny Novgorod estates, and had allocated the use of the income from them. Julie saw Boris's irresolution, and the thought sometimes occupied her that she repulsed him, but at once her feminine self-deception furnished her with the consolation, and she said to herself that it was merely the shyness that comes from love. However, her melancholy began to turn into irritation, and shortly before Boris's departure, she undertook a decisive plan. At the same time that Boris's leave was coming to an end, Anatoly Kuragin appeared in Moscow, and naturally enough in the Karagins' drawing room, and Julie, unexpectedly, abandoning her melancholy, became very cheerful and attentive to Kuragin. Mon cher, Anna Mikhailovna said to her son, je sais de bonne sauce que le prince Basile envoie son fils à Moscow pour lui faire espouser Julie. I love Julie so much that it would be a pity. What do you think, my friend? My dear, I have it from a good source that Prince Vasily is sending his son to Moscow to have him marry Julie. And I love Julie so much that I would find that a pity. What do you think, my friend? Said Anna Mikhailovna. The thought of making a fool of himself and wasting this whole month of heavy, melancholic duty around Julie for nothing, and seeing the income from the Penza estates, already allotted and properly put to use in his imagination, in the hands of another, especially in the hands of stupid Anatoly, offended Boris. He went to the Karagins with the firm intention of making a proposal. Julie met him with a cheerful and careless air, told him casually how merry she had been at last night's ball, and asked him when he was leaving. Though Boris had come with the intention of speaking of his love, and therefore intended to be tender, he began speaking irritably of women's inconsistency, of how easily women could go from sadness to joy, that their mood depended only on who was courting them. Julie became offended and said that it was all true, that a woman needed diversity, that one and the same thing all the time would bore anyone. In that case, I'd advise you, Boris began, wishing to sting her. But at that moment, the offensive thought occurred to him that he might leave Moscow without achieving his goal, and having wasted his efforts, which never happened to him in anything. He stopped in mid-speech, lowered his eyes so as not to see her unpleasantly irritated and irresolute face, and said, It's not at all to quarrel with you that I've come today. On the contrary, he glanced at her to make sure he could go on. All her irritation suddenly vanished, and her anxious, pleading eyes were directed at him in eager expectation. I can always arrange it so that I see her rarely, thought Boris. That's the thing started and must be done. He turned bright red, raised his eyes to her, and said, "You know my feelings for you." There was no need to say any more. Julie's face beamed with triumph and self-congratulations, yet she made Boris say everything that is said on such occasions, that he loved her and had never loved any woman more than her. She knew she could demand that in exchange for the Penza estates and the Nizhny Novgorod woodlands, and she got what she demanded. The bride and groom-to-be, no longer mentioning trees showering darkness and melancholy on them, made plans for the future setting up of a brilliant house in Petersburg, paid visits, and prepared everything for a brilliant wedding. Section 6. At the end of January, Count Ilya Andreich came to Moscow with Natasha and Sonia. The Countess was still unwell and could not come, but it was impossible to wait for her recovery. Prince Andrei was expected in Moscow any day. Besides that, it was necessary to buy the trousseau, and it was necessary to sell the estate near Moscow, and it was necessary to take advantage of the old prince's presence in Moscow and introduce his future daughter-in-law to him. The Rostovs' house in Moscow had not been heated. Besides that, they were coming for a short time. The Countess was not with them, and therefore Ilya Andreich decided to stay in Moscow with Maria Dmitrievna Akrosimov, who had long been offering the Count her hospitality. Late at night, the Rostovs' 4 vehicles drove into Maria Dmitrievna's courtyard on Old Konyushenaya Street. Maria Dmitrievna lived alone. Her daughter was already married. Her sons were all in the army. She held herself as straight as ever, and voiced all her opinions just as loudly, directly, and resolutely, and her whole being seemed to reproach other people for all sorts of weaknesses, passions, and enthusiasms, the possibility of which she did not acknowledge. From early morning, in her dressing jacket, she would busy herself with household chores. Then, on feast days, she would go to church, and from church to the jails and prisons, where she had some business of which she spoke to no one. And on weekdays, she would dress and receive the petitioners of various social conditions who came to her every day, and would then have dinner. At dinner, substantial and tasty, she always had 3 or 4 guests. After dinner, she would play a game of Boston. In the evening, she would have newspapers and new books read to her, while she herself knitted. She rarely made any exception for visits, and if she was visiting, it was only the most important persons in town. She was still up when the Rostovs arrived, and the door to the front hall squeaked on its pulley, letting the Rostovs and their servants in from the cold. Maria Dmitrievna, her spectacles low on her nose and her head thrown back, stood in the doorway of the reception room, glanced at the entering people with a stern, irate look. One might have thought she was angry with them and was about to drive them out if she had not been giving solicitous orders to her people at the same time about where to put up the guests and their things. "The Count's over there," she said, pointing to the suitcases and not greeting anybody. "The young ladies' things are up here to the left." "Well, what are you dawdling for?" she yelled at the maids. "Heat up the samovar. You've grown plumper, prettier," she said, pulling Natasha, pink from the cold, to her by the hood. "Pa, you're cold. Go and take your things off quickly," she cried to the Count, who was about to kiss her hand. "You must be freezing. Serve rum with the tea." "Sonyushka, bonjour," she said to Sonia, giving a special shade by this French greeting to her slightly scornful and affectionate attitude towards Sonia. When, having taken their things off and straightened themselves up after the journey, they all came to tea, Maria Dmitrievna kissed them all in proper order. "I'm heartily glad you've come and are staying with me," she declared. "It's none too soon," she said, glancing significantly at Natasha. "The old man's here, and they expect the son any day. You must make his acquaintance. Well, we'll talk about it later," she added, her glance at Sonia indicating that she did not want to talk about it in her presence. "Now listen," she turned to the Count. "What do you need for tomorrow? Whom will you send for? Shin-Shin?" She bent one finger. "The crybaby Anna Mikhailovna? 2? She's here with her son. Getting married, the son is. Then Bazukov, I suppose. He's here too, with his wife. He ran away from her, but she went galloping after him. He dined with me on Wednesday. Well, and they," she pointed to the girls, "will come with me tomorrow to the Verskaya Chapel, and then we'll stop and see over Shameless. I suppose you'll have to make everything new? Don't go by me. Nowadays they wear sleeves like this." The other day, the young Princess Irina Vasilievna came to see me. A dreadful sight, as if she'd put 2 barrels on her arms. Why, nowadays, there's a new fashion every day. And how are things with you? She asked the Count sternly. Everything suddenly comes at once, the Count replied. Rags to be bought, and now there's also a buyer for the estate and the house. If you could do me the kindness, I'll choose a little moment, drive over to Marinsko for a day, and leave my girls in your hands. All right, with me they'll be safe. With me it's like state custody. I'll take them out wherever necessary and scold them and pet them. Marya Dmitrievna touched the cheek of Natasha, her goddaughter and favorite, with her big hand. The next morning, Marya Dmitrievna took the girls to the Iverskaya chapel and to Madame Aubert-Chalmé, who was so afraid of Marya Dmitrievna that she always let her have dresses for less, so as to get rid of her quickly. Marya Dmitrievna ordered almost the whole trousseau. On coming home, she drove everyone but Natasha out of the room and called her favorite to her armchair. Well now, let's have a talk. I congratulate you on your fiancé. You've hooked a fine one. I'm glad for you. I've known him since he was this high, she indicated some 2 feet from the ground. Natasha was blushing joyfully. I love him and his whole family. Now listen, you know old Prince Nikolai was very much against his son getting married. A crotchety old man. Of course, Prince Andrei is not a child and can do without him, but it's not nice to enter the family against his will. It should be done peacefully, lovingly. You're a clever girl. You'll find a way. Go about it nicely and cleverly, then everything will be all right. Natasha said nothing, out of shyness, as Marya Dmitrievna thought. But in reality, Natasha disliked any interference in the matter of her love for Prince Andrei, which appeared to her so set apart from all human affairs that no one, to her mind, could understand it. She loved and knew only Prince Andrei. He loved her and was to come one day soon and take her. She needed nothing else. You see, I've known him for a long time, and I love Mashenka, your sister-in-law. A sister-in-law has a sharp claw, but this one won't hurt a fly. She asked me to get you together with her. You go to her tomorrow with your father. Be nice and affectionate with her. You're younger than she is, so your young man comes, and you're already acquainted with his sister and father, and they love you. Am I right or not? Won't it be better? Yes, Natasha replied, reluctantly. Section 7. The next day, on Marya Dmitrievna's advice, Count Ilya Andreich went with Natasha to see Prince Nikolai Andreich. The Count set out on this visit in a cheerless mood. Deep in his heart, he was frightened. Their last meeting, during the recruitment, when the Count, in response to his invitation to dinner, had listened to a scathing reprimand for failing to provide men, had remained in Count Ilya Andreich's memory. Natasha, wearing her best dress, was, on the contrary, in a most cheerful mood. It can't be that they won't come to love me, she thought. Everyone has always loved me, and I'm so ready to do everything they want for them, so ready to love him because he's his father and her because she's his sister. There's no reason why they shouldn't love me. They drove up to the old gloomy house on Vizhenka Street and went into the vestibule. Well, God bless us, the Count said, half jokingly, half seriously. But Natasha noticed that her father was flushed as he stepped into the front hall and asked timidly and softly whether the prince and princess were at home. The announcement of their visit caused a commotion among the prince's servants. The footman who went to announce them was stopped by another footman in the reception room, and they whispered about something. A maid ran out to the reception room and hastily said something as well, mentioning the princess. At last, an old footman, with an angry look, came out and told the Rostovs that the prince could not receive them, but the princess asked them to come in. The first to meet the guest was Mademoiselle Bourrienne. She met the father and daughter especially courteously and took them to the princess. The princess, her agitated, frightened face covered with red blotches, ran out, treading heavily to meet the guests, trying in vain to appear casual and affable. Princess Marya disliked Natasha at first sight. She seemed to her too well dressed, flightily merry and vain. Princess Marya did not know that, before seeing her future sister-in-law, she had already ill-disposed herself towards her, being involuntarily envious of her beauty, youth, and happiness, and jealous of her brother's love. Besides this insurmountable feeling of antipathy for her, Princess Marya was also troubled just then because, when the arrival of the Rostovs was announced, the prince had cried out that he did not want them, that Princess Marya could receive them if she liked, but that they were not to be admitted to him. Princess Marya had decided to receive the Rostovs, but was afraid at every moment that the prince might perform some escapade, being very agitated by the Rostovs' arrival. "Well, dear princess, here I brought you my singer," said the count, scraping and looking around uneasily, as if fearing the old prince might walk in. "I'm so glad you'll be getting acquainted. A pity the prince is unwell," and having said a few more general phrases, he got up. "If you will permit me, princess, to deposit my Natasha here for a quarter of an hour, I'll drive over to the dog square, just 2 steps away, to see Anna Semyonovna, and come back for her." Ilya Andreevich had invented this diplomatic ruse in order to give Natasha's future sister-in-law the freedom to talk with her, as he later explained to her, and to avoid the possibility of meeting the prince, whom he feared. He had not said that to his daughter, but Natasha understood her father's fear and anxiety and felt offended. She blushed for her father, became still angrier for having blushed, and gave the princess a bold, defiant look, which said that she was not afraid of anyone. The princess told the count that she was very glad, and only asked him to stay longer at Anna Semyonovna's, and Ilya Andreevich left. Mademoiselle Bourienne, despite the anxious glances cast at her by Princess Marya, who wished to talk privately with Natasha, would not leave the room, and carried on a steady conversation about Moscow pleasures and theaters. Natasha was offended by the confusion that had taken place in the front hall, by her father's uneasiness, and by the unnatural tone of the princess, who, as it seemed to Natasha, was doing her a favor by receiving her, and therefore she found everything disagreeable. She did not like Princess Marya. She found her very plain, affected, and dry. Natasha suddenly shrank morally and involuntarily adopted such a casual tone that it made her still more repellent to Princess Marya. After 5 minutes of painful, false conversation, they heard slippered footsteps rapidly approaching. Princess Marya's face showed fear. The door to the room opened and the prince came in, wearing a white nightcap and a dressing gown. "Ah, miss," he said. "Miss Countess Rostov, if I'm not mistaken. I beg your pardon, I didn't know, miss. Ah, God is my witness, I had no idea you'd honor us with a visit. I was coming to my daughter in this attire. I beg your pardon, God is my witness, I didn't know," he repeated, stressing the word God so unnaturally and so unpleasantly that Princess Marya stood with her eyes cast down, not daring to look either at her father or Natasha. Natasha, having risen and curtsied, also did not know what to do with herself. Mademoiselle Bourienne alone smiled pleasantly. I beg your pardon, as God is my witness, I didn't know," the old man muttered, and having looked at Natasha up and down, he left. Mademoiselle Bourienne was the first to recover after this apparition and began talking about the prince's ill health. Natasha and Princess Marya silently looked at each other, and the longer they looked at each other silently, without saying what they needed to say, the more ill-willed were their thoughts about each other. When the count came back, Natasha was discourteously glad of it, and hastened to leave. At that moment she almost hated this old, dry princess, who could put her in such an awkward position and spend half of an hour with her while saying nothing about Prince Andrei. I couldn't be the first to start talking about him in front of this French woman, thought Natasha. Princess Marya, meanwhile, was suffering over the same thing. She knew what she needed to say to Natasha, but she also could not do it because Mademoiselle Bourienne hindered her, and because she herself did not know why it was so hard for her to start talking about this marriage. When the count was already leaving the room, Princess Marya went up to Natasha with quick steps, took her by the hands and sighed deeply, said, "Wait, I must." Natasha looked at Princess Marya mockingly, not knowing why herself. "Dear Natalie," said Princess Marya, "please know that I am glad my brother has found happiness." She stopped, feeling that she was saying an untruth. Natasha noticed this pause and guessed the reason for it. "I think, Princess, that now it is not the right time to speak of it," Natasha said with outward dignity and coldness, and with tears that she could feel in her throat. What have I said, she thought as soon as she left the room. They waited dinner a long time that day for Natasha. She sat in her room and wept like a child, blowing her nose and sobbing. Sonia stood over her and kissed her hair. "Natasha, what is it?" she said. "What do you care about them? It will all pass, Natasha." "No, if only you knew how offensive it was. As if I—" "Don't say it, Natasha. It's not your fault. So what do you care? Kiss me," said Sonia. Sonia raised her head, kissed her friend on the lips, and pressed her wet face to her. "I can't tell. I don't know. It's nobody's fault," said Natasha. "It's my fault, but it's all terribly painful. Oh, why doesn't he come?" She came out to dinner with red eyes. Marya Dmitrievna, who knew how the prince had received the Rostovs, pretended not to notice Natasha's upset face and bantered firmly and loudly with the count and the other guests at the table. Section 8. That evening the Rostovs went to the opera, for which Marya Dmitrievna had obtained tickets. Natasha did not want to go, but she could not reject Marya Dmitrievna's kindness, which was meant exclusively for her. When she came out, dressed to the reception room, and looked at the big mirror while waiting for her father, saw that she was pretty, very pretty. She felt still more sad. This was a sweet and amorous sadness. My God, if he were here, I wouldn't do it like before, with such stupid shyness at something. I'd embrace him in a new way. Simply, I'd press myself to him, make him look at me with those searching, curious eyes with which he looked at me so often, and then I'd make him laugh as he laughed then. And his eyes, how I see those eyes, thought Natasha. And what to his father and sister matter to me? I love him alone. Him, with his eyes and his face, with his manly and at the same time childlike smile. No, better not to think about him. Not to think. To forget completely for the time being. I won't survive this waiting. I'll start sobbing right now. And she left the mirror, making an effort not to burst into tears. And how can Sonia love Nikolenka so steadily, so peacefully, and wait so long and patiently? She wondered, looking at Sonia, who was coming in, also dressed, holding a fan. No, she's quite different. I can't. Natasha felt so softened and tender-hearted at that moment that it was not enough for her to love and not know that she was loved. She had to embrace the beloved man now, at once, and speak and hear from him the words of love which so filled her heart. While she was riding in the carriage, sitting beside her father and looking pensively at the lights of the street lamps flashing in the frozen window, she felt herself still more in love and more sad, and forgot where she was going and with whom. Falling in with the line of carriages, its wheels squeaking slowly over the snow, the Rostovs' carriage drove up to the theater. Natasha and Sonia quickly jumped out, holding up their skirts. The Count got out, supported by footmen, and the three walked among the entering ladies and gentlemen, and the program sellers to the aisle leading to the box seats. Sounds of music were already coming from behind the closed doors. Natalie, vos cheveux. Natalie, your hair, Sonia whispered, and ushered deferentially and hastily slipped sideways before the ladies and opened the door to the box. The sounds of music became more vivid. Through the door shone the brightly lit rows of boxes with bare shoulders and arms of ladies, and the noisy parterre brilliant with uniforms. The lady who was entering the next box looked Natasha over with envious feminine eyes. The curtain had not yet gone up, and the overture was being played. Natasha, smoothing her dress, walked in together with Sonia and sat down, looking over the lit-up rows of boxes opposite. For a long time she had not expected that feeling, both pleasant and unpleasant, of hundreds of eyes looking at her bare arms and neck, which suddenly seized her now, calling up a whole swarm of memories, desires, and emotions corresponding to that feeling. The two remarkably pretty girls, Natasha and Sonia, along with Count Ilya Andreich, who had not appeared in Moscow for a long time, attracted general attention. Besides, everyone knew vaguely of Natasha's betrothal to Prince Andrei, knew that since the Rostovs had been living in the country, and looked with curiosity at the fiancé of one of the best matches in Russia. Natasha had grown prettier in the country, as everybody told her, and that evening, owing to her agitated state, she was especially pretty. She struck people by her fullness of life and beauty, combined with her indifference to everything around her. Her black eyes gazed at the crowd without seeing anyone. Her slender arm, bared above the elbow, rested on the velvet rail, her hand, opening and closing, obviously unconsciously, in time with the overture, crumpling the program. Look, there's Miss Elenin, said Sonia, and with her mother, I think. Good heavens, Mikhail Kirillich has grown still fatter, said the old count. Look, what a toque Anna Mikhailovna's wearing. The Karagins, Julie and Boris with them. You can see at once they're engaged. Dubretskoy's made a proposal. Yes, I found out today, said Shinshin, coming into the Rostov's box. Natasha followed the direction of her father's gaze and saw Julie, who, with pearls on her fat red neck, which Natasha knew was daubed with powder, was sitting with a happy look next to her mother. Behind them, Boris's head could be seen, handsome, smoothly combed, smiling, its ear inclined to Julie's mouth. He looked at the Rostovs from under his eyebrows and, smiling, said something to his fiancée. They're talking about us, about me and him, Natasha thought, and he must be calming his fiancée's jealousy of me. They needn't worry. If only they knew how little I care about them all. Behind them, in a green toque, with a happy festive face, given over to the will of God, sat Anna Mikhailovna. In their box hung that atmosphere of an engaged couple with which Natasha knew and loved so well. She turned away, and suddenly all that had been humiliating in her morning visit recalled itself to her. What right has he not to want to receive me into his family? Ah, better not to think about it, not to think till he comes, she said to herself, and began looking at the familiar and unfamiliar faces in the parterre. At the front of the parterre, right in the middle, his back leaning on the rail, stood Dolokhov, with a huge mop of curly hair combed upwards, in Persian dress. He stood in full view of the theater, aware that he was attracting the attention of the entire audience, as freely as if he were standing in his own room. Around him in a cluster stood the most brilliant young men in Moscow, and he was clearly the first among them. Count Ilya Andreevich, laughing, nudged the blushing Sonia, pointing to her former admirer. Do you recognize him? He asked. But where has he appeared from? The Count asked Shinshin. Didn't he vanish somewhere? Yes, replied Shinshin. He was in the Caucasus, run away from there, and they say became a minister to some reigning prince in Persia, and killed the Shah's brother there. Well, so all the Moscow ladies are losing their mind. Dolokhov le personne and all said. Now no word is spoken among us without Dolokhov. They swear by him. They invite people for him as if he were a sterlet, said Shinshin. Dolokhov and Anatoly Kuragin have driven all our ladies out of their minds. A tall, beautiful lady entering the neighboring box with an enormous braid and very bared, white, full shoulders and neck, on which hung a double string of big pearls. She took a long time to settle herself, rustling her heavy silk gown. Natasha involuntarily gazed at that neck, the shoulders, the pearls, the coiffure, and admired the beauty of the shoulders and the pearls. At Natasha's look at her for a second time, the lady turned, and meeting Count Ilya Andreevich's eyes, nodded to him and smiled. This was Countess Bezukhov, Pierre's wife. Ilya Andreevich, who knew everybody in the world, leaned over and addressed her. Have you come here long, Countess? He said. I'll come and kiss your hand. I'm here on business, and I've brought my girls along. They say Semyonovna is an incomparable performer, said Ilya Andreevich. Count Pyotr Kirillovich never used to forget us. Is he here? Yes, he wanted to stop by, said Helene, as she looked attentively at Natasha. Count Ilya Andreevich sat back in his place. Fine woman, isn't she? He whispered to Natasha. Wonderful, said Natasha. One could just fall in love with her. At that moment, the last chords of the overture sounded, and the conductor tapped with his battalion. The late-coming men went to their seats in the parterre, and the curtain rose. As soon as the curtain rose, the boxes in the parterre fell silent, and all the men, old and young, in uniforms and tailcoats, all the women in precious stones on bare bodies, with greedy curiosity turned their attention to the stage. Natasha also began to look. And that is where we'll stop for today. That's the end of section 8. These poor children. I can't help but feel bad for Natasha. It's hard to be separated from the person you love. And to feel like their family doesn't accept you, doesn't welcome you in, that's difficult. Why can't people just get along? Also, let's see, there was the house they live. Let's see, the Bolkonskis have a house. You have the name of this street. They drove up to the gloomy old house on. The name of the street is spelled VZDVIZHENKA. If anyone knows how to say that, please help me. There's like way too many consonants right at the beginning. Viz. I have no idea. Viz. It's a lot of consonants altogether. Hard consonants. That's absolutely crazy. So sorry about that. So that I just I need Russian help. So my apologies to anyone who speaks fluent Russian and is deeply offended by my pronunciation. I'm sorry, I tried. But yeah, that's where we'll leave it for today, friends. And we will pick up tomorrow Like I said, I'll always have try to have the video posted before 3, so whenever it's live or it's not, you can always at least watch it at 3, even if it's just the recorded version. So yeah. Like I said, check out the links and the thing and info in the description of the video, and have a great Monday and a great week. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye. Thanks for tuning in.